Preston Davey was 13 months old when he was taken to Blackpool Victoria Hospital in cardiac arrest. His adoptive father, Jamie Varley, claimed that he'd fallen from a bath seat, but the truth was much more sinister. You could see in the jury's faces that they were sad and that you could see the disgust almost, really. I've been a court reporter for almost 20 years. I would say that this is probably the worst case that I've seen. So I first heard about this case when the news broke that little Preston had died. At first, it's always sad to hear about a baby that's died, and then when you hear that somebody's been arrested for murder, it's even more shocking. But as the time went on, the situation came out that he was in the process of being adopted by Jamie Varley and John McGowan-fazakerley.
I'm going to come on to neglect and ill treatment, John. This is all about protecting Preston from harm. You've been shown a series of injury photographs right from the time Preston came into your care and up to his death. And medical professionals on some of these injuries have said that these are non-accidental. How do you explain that?
I have again said during the interview, I have never, ever hurt my son.
It doesn't look good, Jamie. How can you explain that?
I haven't done it.
Well, I'll make the suggestion that you've killed him, Jamie.
You make that suggestion and I'll fight it to the day I die. Because one day, you guys will be in trouble because you are absolutely wrong. I don't know how I'm going to prove it, but you are wrong because I have not done it.
We knew that it was going to be a serious case because Lancashire Police put on a really comprehensive press briefing ahead of the trial, and that was really to make sure that we were all aware of what the case was, but also to alert us to the fact that some of the evidence was going to be very distressing, that this was a child who, the prosecution case was that this child had been abused physically, emotionally and sexually throughout his time with his adoptive parents. So we needed to know what it was that we were going to be seeing in court. Preston Davey was born in June 2022, and at the time that he was born, his mum was serving a prison sentence at Style, HMP Style. He spent 5 days in Wythenshawe Hospital with his mother, and at that point he was taken to be looked after by foster carers in Oldham. He was with the foster carers for about 9 months before Oldham Council made an order that he was going to be adopted, and they set up a matching programme. They started looking around to find a suitable family for him, and that's when they came upon Jamie Varley and John McGowan-fazakerley. They brought in a pool of 60 jurors first off to choose from, so it was clear that it was going to be a serious case. There was, obviously the defendants were in the dock waiting. There was members of each of their families in the public gallery. There was a large amount of press interest as well, because we knew that it was a serious case, and also members of Preston's family were there. They got the jury sworn, and they went through the opening, in which everybody heard some really shocking details, more shocking I think than anybody was really prepared for. And then they heard a couple of witnesses as well. It got about 3 days into the trial, maybe 4 days into the trial, when the whole thing halted. There was issues with the jury, and so they had to discharge that jury and start again with a new jury, essentially starting the process again. First off, we saw CCTV of them arriving at Blackpool Victoria. Medics had really tried to save Preston. They'd done everything they could. They called both the adoptive dads back into the room to see if, to spend his last minutes with him really before they said goodbye to him. Those moments really should have been about Preston, but Jamie Varley made them all about him. He dropped to his knees, he was wailing, he was crying for his mother, he was making comments like, "This is my fault." He'd made up a story basically saying that he'd left Preston in the bath in a secure baby seat just for a minute while he'd gone out of the room to get some clothes, and that Preston had fallen from the seat and gone under the water. So he was making it seem like a very minor oversight, really, that he'd just turned his back for a minute and something terrible had happened. And we were seeing a lot of video evidence. Jamie Varley videoed and photographed everything. He'd even described himself as snap happy in court, so he documented every minute of Preston's life. A lot of it was for Instagram and social media, I believe. It was all very showy. Their house was pristine, they had the nice outfits, they had the wooden toys, everything was just as you'd want it. Some of the footage that we saw was really, really sad to watch. We saw a little boy it was the night before his birthday actually, and he should have been in bed. It was gone 9 o'clock, he was tired, he was exhausted, and he had bags under his eyes, he was just absolutely ready. He should have been in his bed is all there was to it, and for some reason Jamie Varley was keeping him awake. There was loud music playing from a Disney film, and you could see Preston just dropping asleep in his lap. But whereas a loving parent would have put them down in their cot or even just laid them down on the sofa next to them, he shouted at him and he woke him up deliberately, startling him. And you could see that Preston didn't know how to react. He looked confused and startled, and it was so sad to see. You could see in the jury's faces that they were sad, and that you could see the disgust almost, really. And I mean, everybody tries to keep a little bit of a poker face in court because, you know, it's not about facial expressions, but it's hard to hide. There were a couple of times when Preston's birth mother got up and walked out of the courtroom because what she was hearing had happened to her son. Any mother, no mother would be able to hear that and not be moved. No person will be able to hear that and not be moved, actually. It was, you know, there were times when it was shocking. And then on the Monday afternoon, they came back with unanimous verdicts on every charge that was against these defendants. So we had Jamie Varley convicted of murder, GBH, child cruelty, and making and distributing indecent photos of Preston. These were photos that he'd taken himself of the child. And then John McGowan-fazakerley was also found guilty of causing or allowing the death of a child, in that he turned a blind eye to what was going on at home. Cruelty, he didn't seek help, and they were both convicted of a joint sexual assault on Preston 4 days before he died as well. So Preston's mum was serving a prison sentence at the time that he was born. Her name is Sarah Davey, and when she was 14 she was handed an indeterminate prison sentence because she and another teenage girl, a friend of hers, were involved in a brutal murder in the Failsworth area of Manchester. Their victim was a lady called Lily, who was in her 70s, I believe, and these two teenage girls had befriended her and then attacked her in really quite a brutal way in her home. Mrs. Lily had died, and they had then carried her body and dumped her in the canal. So Sarah Davey is quite well known, really. Her story has been reported on many times in the Manchester Evening News. And she'd been recalled to prison a number of times as well. So obviously at the time that Preston was born, she was in HMP Style, and she was in the mother and baby unit. Now, I believe that her mother, Deborah Davey, actually would have been happy to have looked after Preston and to take on the full care of him. But sadly, she was diagnosed with cancer shortly after Preston was born. So all the checks went through just to, you know, to find out when they're looking at the best place to care for Preston. Obviously, he couldn't remain with his mum for whatever reasons. They then start to look at what other family might be able to have him. And she was ruled out, I believe, on ill health grounds. That was the reason why he was put into adoptive care. These two men were a couple, they were a stable couple. From the outside, they seemed very settled. They owned their home, they had professional jobs. Varley was a teacher, McGowan-fazakerley was a salesman, but he was working at a quite senior level as well. They were financially stable, they had a nice home in Blackpool, and they were settled and presented themselves as a couple who just wanted to start a family. John McGowan-fazakerley was the one to first approach the adoption agency. They have regional adoption agencies which take care of adoptions for local councils. So Adoption Now looks after the proceedings for Lancashire and for Greater Manchester. So the way it works, they make an initial inquiry, they do some, they sort of find out a little bit about them. Then they go on to stage 1 of the adoption process, where they check all the criminal records, they go through, they check financial records, they do medicals, health checks, sit down and have interviews with them, just try and establish their suitability as adoptive parents. These two passed everything. There was nothing flagged at any stage during the adoption process that was alerting them to any concerns with either of these two men. So Preston had been in their care for just under 4 months, and in that time he'd been to hospital on 3 separate occasions. Now, one of those occasions he had a fracture to his elbow, which babies of that age, I'm not a doctor, but I believe children that aren't walking, it is quite unusual for them to break bones. Certainly it was later found that it was a non-accidental injury, and that was one of the charges that was the GBH charge that Varley was convicted of. On other occasions, he was taken to hospital, and although he was presenting with signs of an infection, a chest infection, doctors or nurses asked about little bruises on his head. There was one occasion when Jamie Varley produced a video from his phone which showed Preston playing with a toy box. It was one of these, you know, with the little bead frames on the top, and he pulled it down onto himself, and Varley was like, he's just a clumsy baby, these are the sort of things he does. Preston had a little squint in his eye, so social workers who'd visited had noticed that he wasn't necessarily coordinated, that he might reach for a toy but miss it, and they were investigating this turn in his eye to see, you know, whether that was causing some issues that made him fall over and bump his head and things. So really they just passed all these bruises. Anything that was picked up was passed off as he's just a little baby learning to walk, and he's got bumps and bruises. I've been a court reporter for almost 20 years, and I would say that this is probably the worst case that I've seen, the most shocking. I've seen a lot of trials, and I've seen some very, very serious cases, some upsetting cases. Sadly, I have seen other cases of babies who have lost their lives at the hands of bad people.